Imagine moving into what seems like a perfect neighborhood, only to find out it's run by a group of power-hungry wannabe cops abusing their authority and making up laws to control everyone. Now, imagine they set their sights on you, trying to find you, tow your truck, and even arrest you without realizing you're the real sheriff. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. And trust me, they never saw what was coming. And let us know in the comments, where you watching from? We'd love to see how far the story reaches. When I first moved into Oak Ridge Estates, I thought I had finally found the perfect place to settle down. The houses were well kept, the streets were quiet, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful. But it didn't take long to realize that the so-called Homeowners Association was more like a private little dictatorship run by a group of self-important busybodies who had taken upon themselves to enforce their own set of laws. At the center of it all were the so-called HOA officers, a group of middle-aged men wearing navy blue polo shirts with homemade badges and cargo pants tucked into combat boots. They strutted around the community like they were some elite law enforcement unit, complete with cheap walkie-talkies and citation pads filled with nonsense infractions. My first encounter with them happened the day I finished moving in. I had barely finished unloading my truck when one of them, a gruff-looking guy with a beer belly and wraparound sunglasses, strolled up to my driveway and cleared his throat like he was about to issue some grand decree. "Sir, you can't park here overnight," he said, gesturing to my own driveway. HOA regulations prohibit work vehicles from being visible from the street. I glanced at my truck, a standard-issue black pickup with no company logos, no modifications, just a normal truck. "This is my personal vehicle," I told him, barely holding back a laugh. He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. It's a violation." I rolled my eyes and went inside, thinking that was the end of it. But the next morning, I found a bright orange citation taped to my windshield, demanding a $250 fine for unauthorized parking. That was when I knew I had a problem. Over the next week, I watched these so-called enforcers roam the neighborhood like a pack of mall cops who had been given a little too much authority. They harassed people over the length of their grass, fined an elderly couple for having a bird feeder in their yard, and even wrote up a teenager for riding his skateboard on the sidewalk. Every time I saw them, I couldn't shake the feeling that these guys weren't just nosy neighbors with clipboards. They wanted to be real cops, and that was the most dangerous part. It was all a game to them, a twisted little fantasy where they got to play judge, jury, and executioner over people who live there. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that they had picked the wrong guy to mess with. I wasn't just some new homeowner who didn't know my rights. I was the county sheriff, and soon they were going to learn exactly what that meant. I didn't have to wait long for the HOA's fake enforcers to escalate their little power trip. The day after their bogus citation, I decided to ignore it, knowing full well that their so-called fine had no legal authority. But these guys weren't the type to take being ignored lightly. That morning, I was sipping my coffee on the porch when I noticed two of them pacing near the end of my driveway, talking into their cheap walkie-talkies, like they were coordinating some high-stakes operation. One of them, a wiry man with a clipboard, pointed toward my truck, while the other, the beer-bellied one from the day before, nodded and spoke into his radio. I could hear the words unauthorized vehicle and tow request, and that was when I knew they were about to pull something truly stupid. Before I could even set my mug down, a rusted tow truck came rumbling down the street, its driver looking half asleep and uninterested in whatever nonsense these HOA clowns were spewing at him. I walked down my driveway just in time to see them waving the truck over like they were directing traffic at an accident scene. "You might want to think real hard about what you're doing," I said, keeping my voice calm as I approached. The wiry guy turned, his face full of the smug confidence of a man who had never been punched in his life. "Sir, your vehicle is in violation of HOA regulations. We've issued multiple citations, and as per community bylaws, unauthorized vehicles are subject to removal at the owner's expense." I glanced at the tow truck driver, who was still sitting in his cab, looking between me and the two HOA goons like he was debating whether this job was worth the hassle. "I'll tell you what," I said, folding my arms. "Before you so much as hook a chain to my truck, I want you to call the police." The wiry guy scoffed. "That won't be necessary." "Oh, but it will be necessary," I shot back, letting just a hint of my real authority seep into my voice. Because what you're attempting to do right now is called grand theft auto. And since I'm the police, I'd love to see how this plays out. The beer-bellied one paled instantly, his fake bravado draining out of him in an instant. The wiry one, however, wasn't quite as quick on the uptake. "You are the police?" he repeated, narrowing his eyes. "That's a pretty bold claim, buddy." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet, flipping it open to reveal my badge. "Not a claim," I said. "A fact." The reaction was almost comical. The beer-bellied one took a half-step back like I had pulled a live grenade out of my pocket, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. The wiry one, on the other hand, still hadn't figured out just how badly he had screwed up. "Well, that doesn't change the HOA regulations," he insisted, crossing his arms like a petulant child. "We have the right to enforce." I held up a hand. "No, you don't have the right to enforce anything. You are not law enforcement. You are not a government agency. You are a homeowners association, which means you have exactly zero legal authority to tow, fine, or otherwise penalize anyone beyond basic contractual agreements. And considering I never signed any agreement with your little HOA, that means you have no power over me whatsoever." The tow truck driver, sensing where this was going, threw up his hands. "Yeah, I'm out," he muttered before shifting his truck into reverse and backing out of my driveway. The wiry one looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. "You can't just ignore HOA bylaws." I stepped in close, lowering my voice to just above a whisper. "And you can't impersonate a law enforcement officer, which is exactly what you and your little group of pretend cops are doing every time you go around this neighborhood throwing out fake citations and making threats. And if you ever step foot on my property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing, harassment, and attempted grand theft auto." That was the moment it finally sank in. The wiry one swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before. "Oh, I know it's not," I said, watching as they hurried away, their little fantasy of power shattered. I knew guys like them, the kind who didn't take humiliation lightly, the kind who always doubled down when backed into a corner. They had made a mistake coming after me once. I had a feeling they were about to make an even bigger one. I didn't have to wait long for the fake HOA cops to try something even dumber. After the failed attempt to tow my truck, they must have realized that their usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work on me. But instead of backing off, they decided to go all in. And that's how I found myself face to face with the most absurd situation in my life. A group of middle-aged suburbanites trying to place me, the actual county sheriff, under arrest. It happened during one of their so-called HOA community meetings, which was basically just an excuse for them to flex their fake authority in front of the neighborhood. I had no intention of attending, but after the truck incident, my curiosity got the better of me. If these guys were bold enough to try to steal my vehicle in broad daylight, I wanted to see just how deep their delusions ran. So I showed up. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a decently sized building meant for social events, but now transformed into what looked like a makeshift military briefing. The HOA board sat the front behind a long folding table, while the so-called officers stood off to the side, arms crossed like security detail. I took a seat in the back, blending in with the other homeowners who looked equal parts bored and irritated. The president of the HOA, a wiry little man named Gregory Holt, stood up and cleared his throat. "We have some serious matters to discuss tonight," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had been waiting his whole life to feel important. "As many of you know, there's been an ongoing issue with certain residents who refuse to comply with our community standards." His eyes flicked at me for just a fraction of a second, but I caught it. These individuals have ignored fines, disrespected our officers, and even interfered with enforcement actions. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, waiting for the punchline. "And because of these continued violations," Holt continued, puffing himself up like a peacock, "the HOA has been left with no choice but to take further action to protect the integrity of this community." He nodded toward the fake officers, and I watched as two of them stepped forward, Beer Belly and Clipboard Guy. "We are hereby placing resident John Carter under citizen's arrest for repeated violations of community standards, obstruction of HOA enforcement, and aggressive behavior toward officers. I almost laughed out loud. Almost. Instead, I stared at them in stunned disbelief, half expecting someone to jump out and tell me this was all an elaborate prank. But these guys were serious. Dead serious. Clipboard guy pulled a pair of plastic zip tie cuffs from his pocket and stepped toward me like he was about to slap them on my wrists. "Stand up, sir," he ordered, in the same tone of voice a traffic cop might use when issuing a speeding ticket. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." That's when I lost it. Not with anger, not with frustration, but with pure, unfiltered amusement. I burst out laughing, actual belly-clutching, tear-inducing laughter. The entire room went silent. Clipboard guy hesitated, clearly thrown off by my reaction. Holt's face turned a deep shade of red. "This is not a joke," he snapped. "You are under arrest." I wiped a tear from my eye. "Oh, it's definitely a joke," I said, standing up, "and you're the punchline." Clipboard guy took a step forward, still gripping the zip ties. "Sir, if you resist, we will be forced to—" I held up a single finger, cutting him off. Then, with my other hand, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my badge, holding it up for the entire room to see. "County Sheriff's Department," I said, my voice carrying to the clubhouse like a gunshot. "You will be forced to what exactly?" The silence that followed was the kind you only hear in movies right before everything explodes. Clipboard guy froze, the color draining from his face. Beer Belly took a slow step backward. Holt's mouth open and closed, his brain clearly short-circuiting. One of the homeowners in the front row let out a muffled laugh. Another whispered, "Oh, damn." I stepped forward, closing the gap between me and the two fake cops. "Let me explain something to you," I said, my tone casual but firm. "A citizen's arrest is a legal procedure that requires an actual crime to have been committed. Violating HOA rules? Not a crime. Ignoring fines from a group of wannabe lawmen? Not a crime. Telling you to shove your fake authority where the sun doesn't shine? Definitely not a crime." Holt's composure was slipping fast. "You can't just waltz in here and I can and I did," I interrupted, turning my attention to the rest of the room. "And I'll tell you something else. These guys aren't just annoying. They're criminals." I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "See, I've been doing some digging. And what do you know? This little HOA security squad isn't just making up rules. They're impersonating law enforcement, which is a felony. And that's just the beginning." Clipboard guy looked like he was about to pass out. Beer Belly had broken into a sweat. Holt, though, was still clinging to his delusion of control. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "You have no authority over the HOA." I took another step forward, lowering my voice just enough to make sure he knew I meant business. "Oh, but I do," I said, "and you're about to find out just how much." The room was dead silent, except for the nervous shuffling of feet and the occasional call from someone who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. Holt looked like he was about to have an aneurysm, his face shifting through every shade of red in existence. Clipboard guy had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish that had just been yanked out of water. Beer Belly wiped at the sweat dripping down his forehead, his bravado long gone. And me? I was just getting started. I let the silence stretch for a moment longer before I reached into my back pocket again and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around to face the room. "You see this?" I asked, my voice steady. On the screen was a recording. Their recording, to be exact. One of the homeowners, a sharp old man sitting in the back, had tipped me off that the HOA had a habit of recording their meetings, probably because they thought it made them look more official. So I had done some digging and, sure enough, found that they stored their past meetings in a public access Google Drive folder. And lucky for me, these morons were arrogant enough to discuss their plans out loud in those very meetings. I pressed play, and their voices filled the clubhouse. "We need to set an example." Holt's voice rang out in the recording. "If we let him get away with ignoring our rules, other residents might start pushing back. What about legal repercussions?" Clipboard guy's voice. "Couldn't we get in trouble for this?" "It's only a crime if they call the real police," Holt had said, "and we control the neighborhood. If we make them think we have authority, They won't question it. I paused the recording and looked around the room. A few of the homeowners were whispering now, casting nervous glances at each other. A woman near the front clutched her purse like she was just now realizing she might have been funding a criminal enterprise this entire time. Holt looked like he wanted to strangle me, but he kept his mouth shut, probably realizing that anything he said could and would be used against him. Now, I continued, sliding my phone back into my pocket. I'm no lawyer, but I'd say that sounds an awful lot like conspiracy to commit fraud and impersonation of law enforcement. And since you guys have been issuing fake fines and collecting money from homeowners under false pretenses, you can go ahead and throw theft by deception on top of that. Clipboard guy made a choking noise, and Beer Belly took another step back, his hands up like he was surrendering. Holt, to his credit, hadn't given up yet. He straightened his spine and tried to regain some control over the situation. You have no proof of actual wrongdoing, he said, his voice tight. I grinned. That's funny, I said, pulling out another piece of paper. Because this here is a formal complaint from multiple homeowners who say they've been harassed, fined, and threatened by you and your fake police force. Some of them have even lost thousands of dollars because of your scams. I turned slightly, gesturing to a woman in the front row. Mrs. Calloway, would you like to confirm that? She nodded, her lips pressed together in anger. They took over $8,000 from me over the last 2 years, she said, her voice shaking. Said my fence was 2 inches too high, and that I had to pay or they'd put a lien on my house. Holt flinched but didn't respond. I nodded and turned to an older man in the second row. Mr. Dawson? He grunted. They sent me fake legal notices saying they'd take me to court if I didn't pay up. He turned to glare at Holt. You told me it was for the good of the neighborhood, Greg. Said we had to maintain order. And that's just 2 people. I continued, pacing now. I've got a whole stack of complaints right here. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over every single financial record this HOA has. Bank statements, payment logs, the works. And if you don't, I'll make sure the state attorney's office gets involved. Holt was practically vibrating with fury now. You can't do this, he snapped. You don't have jurisdiction here. I raised an eyebrow. That's adorable, I said, because not only do I have jurisdiction, but I've already taken the liberty of calling in some backup. Right on cue, the front doors of the clubhouse swung open, and 3 uniformed sheriff's deputies walked in, their expressions unreadable. The room collectively inhaled. Holt took a step back. Clipboard guy swallowed hard. Beer Belly looked like he was about to pass out. I turned back to Holt and smiled. Greg, I said, I'd like you to meet some real law enforcement officers. They're here to make sure everything goes nice and smooth from here on out. The walls of their little empire were crumbling fast, and I wasn't going to stop until there was nothing left. Ho had no more cards to play. The moment the real deputies stepped into the room, whatever delusions of control he had left evaporated. Clipboard guy and Beer Belly looked like they wanted to sink into floor. The homeowners, who had been sitting quietly just moments ago, started murmuring among themselves. Some were whispering in disbelief, others in outrage. The dam had broken, and the flood of truth was coming whether Holt liked it or not. One of my deputies, a no-nonsense officer named Ramirez, stepped forward, resting a hand on her belt. We receive a report of criminal activity being conducted under the guise of an HOA enforcement group, she said, her eyes sweeping the room. We have reason to believe that members of this organization have engaged in fraudulent practices, impersonation of law enforcement, and financial extortion of homeowners. Holt let out a strangled laugh, but it sounded weak. This is insane, he said, his voice cracking. You can't just barge in here and, actually, we can. I interrupted, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. This here is a search warrant, signed off by a judge this morning. I let that sink in for a moment before handing it to Ramirez. So, we're going to be taking a look at every single document, financial record, and so-called citation this HOA has issued over the past 5 years. The color drained from Holt's face. You can't. We can, Ramirez said, stepping forward. And we will. At that moment, the other 2 deputies moved in, one heading straight for the file cabinet in the corner of the room, while the other approached the HOA's makeshift security team. Clipboard guy visibly flinched when a deputy stopped in front of him. "Let's see that badge," the deputy said. Clipboard guy hesitated, then slowly reached up and unclipped the cheap metal emblem from his polo shirt. The deputy took it, turning it over in his hands before letting out a scoff. "You bought these online, didn't you?" he asked. Clipboard guy swallowed hard. "I save it," the deputy said, pocketing the badge. "You realize impersonating law enforcement is a felony, right?" Beer Belly let out a noise that sounded somewhere between a cough and a whimper. "We didn't impersonate." "Oh, really?" I asked, pulling out my phone again. "Because I've got video evidence of you threatening homeowners, using police-style jargon, and attempting to arrest me with plastic zip ties." The deputy turned to Beer Belly. "Put your hands where I can see them." His face twisted with panic. "Wait, hands. Now." With a defeated groan, he slowly raised his hands. The deputy spun him around, yanking his arms behind his back and slapping on a pair of real handcuffs. Clipboard guy was next, offering no resistance as his wrists were cuffed. The room erupted into hushed whispers, some people pulling out their phones to record. Holt, watching his two goons had hauled off, took a staggering step backward. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This can't be happening." I walked up to him, arms crossed. "Oh, it's happening, Greg," I said, my voice cool. "And guess what? You're next." His head snapped up, eyes wild with disbelief. "You have no proof of—" "Oh, I have plenty of proof." I cut in. "The financial records we're about to seize? Those are going to tell us just how much money you extorted from this community. And judging by what I've already seen, I'm betting it's a lot." Holt's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind was racing, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "You want to know the best part?" I continued, leaning in slightly. "The fines you issued, the liens you threatened, the bogus citations, none of it was legally binding, which means every single person in this neighborhood you conned into paying you. They can sue you, and trust me, they will." A man in the front row stood up, folding his arms. "Damn right, we will." A woman near the back nodded. "You stole thousands from me, Greg. You're going to pay for this." More voices joined in, the quiet discontent shifting into full-blown fury. Holt's face crumpled, his last shred of defiance slipping away. He didn't resist when Ramirez pulled out her cuffs and snapped them around his wrists. "Gregory Holt," she said, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The room burst into a mixture of applause and shouting. Holt, his face now ghostly pale, was led out the door, his head hanging low. The deputies finished confiscating documents, loading up boxes of files and computers. By the time the dust settled, the HOA's so-called leadership had been entirely dismantled. The fake officers were facing felony charges. Holt was looking at serious jail time. And the neighborhood? The neighborhood was finally free. But I wasn't done yet. There was one last thing I needed to do to make sure this mess never happened again. With Holt and his fake cops hauled off in the back of squad cars, you'd think that would be the end of it. But I wasn't about to leave this neighborhood in the rubble of their corruption. No. I want to make sure that every single person affected by this scam got justice. And more importantly, I wanted to make damn sure that nothing like this ever happened here again. Because here's the thing about HOA scams. If you don't burn them down to foundation, someone else will just crawl in and pick up where the last crook left off. So I went to work. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into the HOA's finances blew wide open. It turned out Holt and his goons weren't just pocketing homeowners' money. They were laundering it. The so-called maintenance fees that residents have been forced to pay? Yeah, none of that ever went to actual neighborhood upkeep. Instead, it went straight into offshore accounts, personal vacations, and, get this, Holt's private security fund. The idiot had actually been using HOA money to pay his fake officers under the table. This wasn't just some neighborhood scam. This was organized crime. The court hearings were brutal. Homeowners lined up to testify, recounting years of harassment, fraudulent fines, and threats. The state attorney slapped Holt with a laundry list of charges, wire fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, and impersonation of law enforcement. Clipboard Guy and Beer Belly weren't spared either. Turns out they had been actively involved in the scam, helping Holt forge legal documents and fake citations. Each of them was facing prison time, and when it became clear that there was no easy way out, they started turning on each other. Clipboard Guy tried to claim he was just following orders. Beer Belly blamed everything on Holt, saying he was pressured into it. Holt, true to form, threw everyone under the bus, claiming he was only doing what was best for the community. The judge wasn't buying a word of it. Holt was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Clipboard Guy and Beer Belly each got 10 years. The court ordered that all embezzled funds be repaid to the homeowners. Between civil lawsuits and asset seizures, Holt lost everything. His house, his car, his savings gone. His family, ashamed and humiliated, left town. The HOA itself dissolved permanently by court order. That meant every bogus rule, every fake fine, every idiotic regulation these clowns had put in place was completely erased. No more unnecessary fees. No more ridiculous vehicle bans. No more fake cops harassing people over their mailboxes. But I wasn't done. The homeowners who have been scammed deserve more than just their money back. They deserve to have their lives back. So I worked with local officials to ensure that a new homeowners committee was formed. One without any power-hungry HOA dictators trying to run it like their own personal empire. Instead of some bloated, unnecessary HOA, the neighborhood elected a resident-led community board. One that actually served the people instead of exploiting them. And let me tell you, it was a thing of beauty. The first thing they did, held a block party in the very same clubhouse where Holt had once tried to have me arrested. People brought food. Kids ran around without fear of being fined for unsupervised play. And for the first time in years, this neighborhood actually felt like community. And me? Well, I got a hell of a lot of thank you notes and more than a few beers sent my way at the local bar. But the real reward? Watching the look on Holt's face the last time I saw him in court, just before they took him away. He went from being the king of his little empire to just another crook in an orange jumpsuit, powerless and forgotten. So if there's a lesson in all of this, it's simple. Power-hungry wannabe cops are dangerous idiots. HOAs can be absolute scams. And if you're going to try and arrest someone, make sure they're not the actual sheriff.